Hello, and welcome to episode 34 of TBR, the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about the books we love and the topics that interest us. I'm Patrick Stemp, and with me, as always, are Michael Ronn and Jamie Maltman. How you guys doing?
Great. Happy Saturday.
Yeah, it's a little unusual time, and so the reason we're broadcasting at a different time on a different day is because we are joined by guest author Dave Higgins. How are you, Dave?
I'm well, and thanks very much for moving things to a time I'm awake.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming. I was going to say tonight, but today we're going to be talking about reading standards. And, do they vary from genre to genre? And does reading a large number of books require a lower quality threshold? Is the question we're going to try to answer today. But first of all, we're going to talk about our reading. So, Dave, as our guest, would you like to tell us a little bit about sort of the kinds of things you enjoy reading in general, and then maybe what you've been reading recently?
Well, I enjoy reading almost anything from cereal packets up, although I wouldn't say I go out of my way to read the back of cereal boxes. But books-wise, I love most subsets of speculative fiction, but I also like some romance, some literary fiction, whatever that is these days, because the definition seems to keep shifting. I read a lot of poetry, surrealist fiction. I can't really think of anything that I'd say, no, I don't read that. But at the core of it, definitely speculative fiction, so horror, science fiction, fantasy. And the last sort of about a week, I've actually been on a rereading spree. So I've read the first 3 books of Raymond E. Feist's Rift War epics, which are they're quite fun, but it's very my thoughts, having read them again as an adult who's been an author for a while, are very different from what they are when I first read them as a teenager. So possibly because that comes into our topic for tonight, I won't go into too much about what I thought about those, other than they do still hold up as enjoyable books, despite the fact I've read them several times. Apart from that, I read Greg Lynn's First Kill, the second in his Team of Goblins trilogy, which is some solid comic fantasy from the perspective of a traditional bad guy race. So it's got the stuff you'd expect of a goblin race, that they're short, brutish, and crude, but also it's very sympathetic portrayal of them, so very definitely still great protagonists. So
and those are novellas, right? Those are novellas.
They're novellas, right? Yeah. It's like sort of 20, 30,000 words. So it's, well, for me, it's a quick read, sort of between doing things on a weekend. For most people, I'd say an evening or two. So it's light, it's fast-paced, which means it goes even faster. So definitely worth it. And book 3 coming soon, which should be good. I've also been reading a lot of books for other authors who are at various stages. So beta reading, proofing, bit of editing. So that's been taking up a reasonable chunk of my reading time for the week. But obviously I can't really talk that much about them because they're not even on advanced review yet. As it turns out, this has been one of my less busy weeks from the perspective of how many books I can talk about having read.
It sounds like you're still reading quite a bit. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You have me beat.
Well, you're no Amy Schubert, but no.
So then, Jamie, how about you? We were talking a little bit before the show. So as this is a special episode, there really hasn't been much time passed between our last episode and this. But did you manage to bang out 3 or 4 books in the last couple days?
Not quite 3 or 4 books, but I did finish with my son. We finished Bone Volume 6. So that was The Old Man's Cave.
Yeah.
Which is funny. Like, he just said afterwards, he's like, this one wasn't as funny. And I'm like, no. And he's like, I don't know. Like, there's a few parts that are getting a little bit more scary, a little bit more disturbing to him. And so it's been interesting seeing that transition. Whereas, he was like, not like way back. Like, I think 4 was more funny. And then I was like, well, what about the quiche guys? And he's like, oh yeah, 5 was funny too, but 6 is not funny.
Yeah.
So
It definitely changes tone.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
Yeah, it's more epic for sure, in terms of all the stuff exploding and going on and what have you. I don't know. Some was visually funny, but anyway. So that was the one that we finished. So and then we started on to number 7. So we're a little, a couple of chapters in there. Which is 7 was called Ghost Circles, right? I've been continuing to read that one that I've got in that fantasy book club, the Rogues anthology, short story anthology. So it's edited by George R.R. Martin and Gardner Dozois. And so I've finished about a third of the way through, which has been a bunch of stories. It's been really interesting. Like, there's a whole bunch of different authors that some of I've heard of, some that I hadn't. The second story was actually by Gillian Flynn, so the Gone Girl sort of mega bestseller recently. But that one was a weird, creepy, twisty story, and like basically the overarching theme is rogues. So there's going to be some kind of roguish character, or lots of them, in every story. And that one was sort of multi-layered roguish and was really quite creepy and disturbing, but well done. There's another one by Matthew Hughes. That one was pretty cool. Different sort of take on. There was a thief, and there was some really neat magical stuff happening. There was it really runs the gamut. This Joe R. Lansdale one was more of a gritty vigilante modern day thing with a bunch of stuff, drug stuff happening in this small town. But definitely, I don't think there was a non-rogue in the story. There was a Tawny Petticoat by Michael Swanwick. This guy did more. It's a really weird combination of there's zombie plantations in New Orleans, and these guys are trying to run this big swindle and are trying not to get swindled themselves, and that was actually pretty cool. So
what's a zombie plantation? Like growing zombies?
When people get into debt, they turn them into zombies until their debts are paid off. And what happens is people keep exporting. People keep sending their debtors down to New Orleans, and then nobody's ever going to come and say that they've discharged their debt. So basically, it's indefinite for a bunch of them. So they have this big zombie army. It's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And that was just a minor aspect of this. There's dinosaur stuff happening. This guy's got all sorts of crazy speculative elements all mashed together, but sort of in the background. And then there's a really neat different one. Was a more historical one. It's one called Providence by David W. Ball. That's all about this guy buying Caravaggio, and he's giving the provenance of all these short stories of how that came to be in his hands right now. And there's really neat roguish stuff happening with that. So I'm really enjoying it. It's definitely multi-genre, but with this rogues theme, and I'm excited to get to some of the Patrick Rothfuss and Neil Gaiman and George R.R. Martin and Scott Lynch later. But it's been cool so far.
How old is that collection? Is that brand new, or is it?
This is last year. Yeah, my library got it in September. So again, it's the third one that they've done like this. There was the Warriors one first, and then Dangerous Women was the previous year. And I actually have that out of the library that I might read after this if I don't switch to something else. And then I've been continuing to read that Consider the Fork, which is I'm loving that. It's just so cool. A history of food and how we eat it. And so they've got chapters on pots, and it's fascinating, the way that it's been just different over time, and then stuff on knives and how knives are totally different in different cuisines, and how sometimes one shift, all of a sudden all the utensils don't matter anymore. When they switch to open hearth roasting to other different forms of cooking and stuff, and some really interesting commentary on the degeneration of British, the way that French people would always make fun of British cooking, right? There was a time when there was the expertise in the roasting of beef and stuff was incredible, and there's just cultural conditions for that made that actually something amazing. And then the boiling all started to really happen. the nadir being World War II, right? So, but anyway, that's a fantastic book. I'm really enjoying that, and that was by B. Wilson. So about a third of the way through that as well. So parallel. That's my daytime reading. I actually read a lot of the time at the table while I'm eating, and then the other one's my bedtime reading.
Okay, cool. How about you, Michael?
Well, it's been pretty light for me because it's only been a couple of days since our last episode. But I was rereading Dean Wesley Smith books, Killing the Top 10 Sacred Cows of Publishing, and then Killing the Top 10 Indie Sacred Cows of Publishing. So I've read those books probably twice already, but I really like Dean Wesley Smith, and so just decided to reread him again, and it's been some pretty good advice. It definitely is helping me out as I'm finishing up my next book here in the next couple of days, so that should be exciting. And then I also have been reading, I forget the exact name of it, but it's Derek Murphy's book, Book Cover Design Secrets, and just basically his opinions on book cover design and typography and fonts, and if you really needed to, how to do it in Microsoft Word, which it's just interesting. I've actually never read a book on book design, and I was looking on Amazon and all the other places, and I realized that there actually are no books on how to design a book cover, which is, you would think there would be more resources on it, so he's really selling up the market. So it was worth reading just to see how he thinks about covers and typography, because he sees stuff that I would never consider in a million years, in terms of what makes a good cover. And so now I'm looking at all my book covers and I'm like, oh man, I got to either redo them or think differently as I move forward.
Are you reading that to help you sort of articulate better yourself when you're talking to somebody else who's doing a cover, or are you looking at sort of maybe doing some of your own covers yourself?
A mixture of both. I'm not really keen on doing my own covers, but I just think it's interesting to see a different perspective. I just love perspectives, so just seeing someone who has a different experience level and looking at the same thing that I am, I think is very valuable. So that's what I've been reading this week, and I'm going to get back to some more fiction here after the weekend. So by our next episode, I will have another novel read. Cross my fingers. What about you, Patrick?
Well, I've been focusing on reading Regulation 19 by P.T. Hilton. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it's I'm about 60% of the way through. I'm enjoying it so far. It's about a city that seems to have been sort of cut off from the rest of the world. So, of course, we don't really know what the situation is in the rest of the world. But the central character is a murderer who's been let out of prison on condition that he help sort of the leaders of the town that he's from find his brother who's been off making all kinds of trouble for them, I guess. And it's cool. It's a good little story. It's kind of in a mountain town, and I will definitely talk more about it when I'm done reading it.
Well, we have some comments.
Oh, go ahead.
We've got some live watchers. Anita Solver is watching. She says,
Anita?
yay, live. There's a first time for everything. Hello, boys. And she also says, hi, Simon, who's also watching. Simon Canton, friend of the show. Fortunate for us when the podcast gets moved to our fit side of the world. And then Dave, our guest, says, Anita, I did offer to do it at the usual time, but everyone agreed Zombie Dave would be too surreal. And as I mentioned before, Simon Canton is also watching. So, hey, Simon.
And yeah, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. So, are we good to move on to our topic?
Yeah.
So the reading standards was something that we thought might be interesting to talk about. So specifically in the description, we were saying, do your standards of what you expect in a book vary depending on what genre you're reading? If you've read a ton of books in a particular genre, does that mean that you have a higher threshold or a higher expectation because you need it to be good, or a lower threshold because maybe you're willing to read anything you can just because you love that genre so much? So who wants to kind of dive in?
Don't all jump at once.
Listen to that dead air.
Well, then that defaults to the guest.
Oh, put Dave on the spot. There you go.
It depends, and this is this is a word that people who know me well would probably be expecting me to shoehorn in as soon as possible, on your granularity. If you take the question, is this book good or not, so you're just taking a binary stance, then I think the more books you read, the more of them are going to fail against the standard. But for me, picking a book isn't about just, is this good, yes, no. It's about a number of things. There's sort of the plot, the characters, the way it's written. So if someone has come up with a great idea and actually has characters who I'm interested in, then I'll cope more than I would in another book with spelling errors, the occasional clunky sentence, some sections of weak voice, which is where we return to Raymond Feist. I mean, the Magician, the first one in the series, the first book he had published, reading through it again with the benefit of years of writing experience as an author and as a lawyer, there are sections where the language is quite passive, where it isn't driving the plot along, it's putting a barrier between the readers. But because the overall idea of this massive invasion and characters discovering themselves and so on is good, it's easier to coast over the times when the writing from a technical perspective isn't so sharp. So the pinnacle of, or nadir, depending on which direction you come at, of my taking books on a number of standards is vampire fiction. I love vampire fiction. I'll read almost anything that's got vampires in just because it's got vampires in. And I have read and enjoyed some books that potentially could have done with another editing pass or two, because there was an interesting tweak on vampirism in there. And conversely, sort of some literary books, I mean, Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, and some of his other works, they're very famous for being great American novels. I can see why they're taught in schools, but rich people having a bit of a sad life isn't something that really grabs me. I mean, it's reality television as a plot. So the thing that's good about Fitzgerald is the style of his writing. So whilst I read it for that, I'm only enjoying it for the fact that he's describing something that doesn't really interest me very well in a beautiful way. So at that level, I'm reading his work for a completely different reason and enjoying a different aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned vampires, and that kind of reminded me, and maybe want to ask you, have you read Brian Lumley's Dead Speak series? I think the series itself was called the Necroscope.
Necroscope series, yeah. I've read most of them. It's another one of those series that it started off and it seems to have carried on going as he brings in new characters, new threats, new plot lines. But the original trilogy is great. I've read that a couple of times. And
yeah, I was thinking about, like you were saying, I kind of wonder if that one would hold up like the Feist books did for you, because it's been years since I read them, and unfortunately they're extremely difficult to find. Like they haven't, I can't find them in the used bookstores. The library doesn't have them. The bookstores only have, book 8 forward or whatever. So I'm kind of keeping my eyes out for those. Like it might be an interesting reread.
The first 3 hold up well. I've read the trilogy he did that was sort of in parallel, that was set about different characters in mostly in the other universe a couple of times, and that holds up well. But when it got to the point where there were vampires breaking through into this world again and setting up conspiracies and hiding out, it started to take on a sameness. I mean, there weren't new innovations about vampirism in there, and there weren't the original characters so much that you'd carry on reading just to find out what happened to Harry Keogh and so on.
Yeah, and I think that's...
The late blander somehow.
So I was going to say, like and I think that's something where your threshold really does depend on how much reading you've done, right? So and it doesn't necessarily mean the book isn't good, to use that sort of the black and white again, but and I think we've seen that where a book that, because I've read so much that a book like City of Bones or stuff like that, that's some more of the YA, may not seem good to me, but it's because it's using tropes and things that I've read before. So it's more my threshold for something new. And so that's where I think that the more you read, the more excited you kind of get about when something does come along that surprises you, because it's a plot twist that you never saw coming, or we're a lot harder to fool now than we were 20 years ago, right?
Oh, definitely. I think I don't know if it's just sort of tropes. I mean, it can be styles, voices as well. And I like a lot of Stephen King's books, and some of them more than others. But I very definitely couldn't read 2 Stephen King books in close succession, because there's something about his style that doesn't flow in the same way as other books. Mm-hmm. So with sort of some authors, I can get all 3 of their trilogy and read them back to back, like I'm doing with Raymond Feist. But if I tried to read a couple of Stephen King's, I think his habit of constantly referring to things the characters have experienced without ever explaining fully what it is. About a third of the way into a second Stephen King book, that would start to really irritate me, and I just wanted to get to the point.
Yeah, I found I love Stephen King too, and the one sort of thing that the tangent that he can go off on sometimes was what would get me, where maybe this is kind of what you're talking about too, where when he does get into the backstory, so he'll say, okay, and there's this thing that happened to this character when they were a child that's important, and where I think a lot of authors would tell that story in a page or two, he'll go on for 100 pages about he'll really get into that backstory before he comes back to the main point, and it's very well written, and it's engaging, and it's interesting, but it's not the main story, right? Jamie, Michael, are you guys frozen or just quiet?
No, we're just quiet.
We're just listening.
Yeah, I was just thinking of one sort of aspect of that's changed so much for me was, like, in my, I guess, sort of tween to teen years with, like, all the, like, Dungeons & Dragons novels, so all those, like, Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance and everything. Like, at the time, I wanted to read every single nook and cranny of every single one of those. And I'd read their Kender's Gully Dwarves and Gnomes stories. That most of those are not good at all, but like it's because it's like I want to explore this world in all these different aspects. Whereas I think some of those books might stand up to an extent. They're still a little hollow in some ways, but like there's some really cool stories in the main sort of like those main Dragonlance trilogies, or some of the main Forgotten Realms stuff, or the early Salvatore stuff. And I haven't even I go into the bookstore and I see he's been writing ever since, and he's got dozens and dozens of these books all set in like his Dark Elf world and stuff like that, and I'm like, wow, that's awesome. I have no interest in reading that right now. And he's actually in the world of Dungeons and Dragons writers, he was a good one, right? But so I don't know. I guess that partially gets to your newness aspect, but it's neat how that changes over time. I was talking to my wife about this too, where she was saying how some of the different takes on it, exactly what Dave was saying. Like, you can go completely different ways. It's like, I love Roman stuff, so I will try a lot of different Roman stuff, but it's still got to grab me now. Like, the days where I would just read it anyway. and that's been a more recent change for me, where the not having to finish books. Like I only really got to that in the last couple of years. Before that, I was always just I gotta finish this book. If I take this book out, or if I, again, and even from the library, it's really stupid to go that way. If you're not enjoying it, just stop. But now my threshold for continuing has gone up, and really do think it's just you get more refined in your tastes and what you're looking for and what bothers you. Like exactly like Dave was saying on those particular little aspects. The funny thing I would say with Stephen King specifically is I found it refreshing switching over from some of the other epic fantasy type stuff that I had been reading to read a Stephen King, because it's so cut down and spare and immediate in the way that he's writing a lot of it. And so that was neat. And I never do. Like, when I started reading the Dark Tower, I don't think I even read like 2 or 3 in a row. I was still switching back and forth, so maybe I never got to that realization. I haven't read, a lot of the Horror Kings, so maybe some of those other things you're talking about.
I think you're
more in those.
I think you're also just, if you're aware of what you're reading too when you're talking about. I mean, in two different points, I guess, where if you are going to go back and read science fiction that was written, in the 40s or 50s, on the one hand, you might be sitting going like, well, this is crap. I've seen all this before, not realizing like this is the first book that like this was actually really, this was brand new. No one had ever done this back then. Or if you're going to go back and read the pulpy magazine stuff, right? That maybe just had a lower threshold for, because they were putting out an issue every week, and they just were buying up stories and paying a half a penny a word or whatever. And if it's meant to be pulpy, it's okay that it's pulpy, right?
Yeah, and there's something to be said too about age in reading, because I know that maybe this is a famous example, but I found it to be true with all the people that I know. But take The Catcher in the Rye, right? Have any of you guys read that? I read it when I was in my early 20s, and I hated it. It was just kind of just a whiny baby, basically. That to me, he was just a big baby, trying to rebel against his parents and the wonderful life that they had created for him. And I talked to people who had read it, and they said, well, I read it when I was 16 or 17, and it really spoke to me. Or, I read it when I was, a teenager in the 60s, and, it said something about the culture at that time. And so those people had different views on it. And so I wonder if I had read the book when I was 15 or 16, if I would have viewed it differently. And there's something to be said about that as I get older too. The books that I reading now, maybe I'll come back to them and see something totally different, because your perspectives change as you get older. And I think there's something to be said for that too.
Yeah, for sure.
Another point that Dave made about sometimes you'll follow the characters even if it's there was some of that in some of those series that you're talking about. One particular series that has definitely varying quality, and anyone would say that, is Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth series, which was a great standalone book. The first book worked really well with something coming next. But it's been interesting as the thing that you couldn't put your finger on, as I've heard more writers start to talk about it. I was watching a panel of fantasy writers talking about it. They were saying basically the level of his magic is up to here at the end of book 1. And now you want to continue the series. What do you do with that? And so there's some sort of quality of magic system-y stuff there in terms of, okay, now you've got to have a more epic thing. So it's like even bigger evil magic comes so that he still can't beat it on it. Like he's going to have to grow. And then the series continues for another 10 books after that. And so he's had to incapacitate him completely. He's had to do all sorts of things. He's gone on his other tangents of, talking about different characters or talking about economic systems, which I actually liked. And now he's changed it. Now he's changed his pacing in his most recent ones, where it's like he's trying to be like a James Patterson thriller type. The way that it's just paced and the way that even just the chapters are done and stuff like that. And he's changed again. But I really liked those characters, and I connected to them a long time ago, like those main characters. And just the fact that it's this the very powerful, equal, magical couple that have this relationship and stuff. I don't know. There's something good with that. My wife and I have talked about that, and she liked it too. But so even though I'm not enjoying a whole bunch of things about it, as a writer now, looking at those most recent books, there's a few things that I'm just like, I really don't. But I got to find out what happened to them, and it's still going on, and I don't know. And then it's like the most recent one is like almost like a serial without him saying that up front. So it's like it's really like a book in 3 parts. With a few, I don't know. It's just
I can see
messy
where you're
stuff.
I can see where you're coming from, because I think I've experienced the same thing, like with the Lee Child, with the Jack Reacher books, right? What was it, 19? I think the last book that came out was book 19, and they're starting to get a little samey, right? Like, and I don't know if it's. I think it's 2 things. I think the quality is starting to suffer a little bit. It's kind of he's just churning them out. The writing, the writing's still the same. The character is never going to grow, which is unfortunate. I would love to see him kind of throw a wrench in the works and go in a different direction, but he never will. Why would he, right? If don't fix what isn't broken, I guess, if he's selling millions of books. So and
He's
there,
pretty clear about that. If you hear him talk about the series, he's like, why would I do anything else? This is
right, exactly.
As a writer, I don't need to I print the money.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a series where you could pick up any book in the series and you wouldn't be missing out on anything. And so it's I think the threshold there for me is, if you're going to write 19 or 20 books in the series, I need the quality to get better almost. Otherwise, I feel like I've read the same book 19 times, right? And that's series.
I guess, are you unusual in that? Like, or have you sort of grown as a reader more recently? And if someone only reads a couple of books a year, does that ever happen for them? And that's the answer probably no, right? Like they'll read his Lee Child book that comes out and maybe some other similar thing, and that's it, and that's good enough.
Yep. Whereas I want something new and interesting that I haven't seen before.
I don't necessarily care if it's new or interesting. I just think the storytelling needs to be good. I guess my standards have changed over time. I used to always be looking for the craziest thing I could. That's why I love books with anthropomorphic characters. But I don't know. I've been reading some books lately that just, I don't know. I'm just starting to really appreciate just good storytelling. Regardless of who it is or what the book is about. Maybe that's just me, but.
Any
dead silence.
Yeah.
All right, we have some comments by watchers here. Quotidian Light is watching. She says, "Great point, Michael. I love your thoughts on perspectives changing." And Simon Canton poses a question. He asks, "Does reading a lot mean that you'll give up on a book earlier because you know the kind of thing it is and you won't like it?" Any thoughts?
I will absolutely put a book down if I'm not enjoying it. And honestly, that doesn't happen too much. I think the last book I kind of put down was The Maze Runner. And I'll be honest, I didn't really give that book a fair shake. But I had just come off reading a couple other YA books that I didn't enjoy. And
You mean you read it after Divergent, right?
Yes. And so I read, and I think I can't judge that book, like I said, because I didn't give it enough of a shake, but it didn't drag me in fast enough. I felt like I need to put these books away and go back to something that I know I will like. Life's too short to keep on reading a book that you're just not enjoying, unless you're trying to learn something from it, as to figure out, because you can learn from bad as well as good, right?
Could that also be an example of the YA version of what you were saying about sci-fi? Because Maze Runner was what, like later 90s, mid to late 90s? So he was before all these other guys. So, but you just happened to read it in the wrong order from that perspective. But does that also mean it just doesn't stand up in some ways too?
Yeah. And like I said, I didn't. I think I gave that thing one chapter, and that's not, again, a commentary on the book necessarily. Maybe more just about where I was when I was reading it. I was not in the mood for that anymore.
Are you ever in the mood for that?
I would, yeah, maybe.
You just made me think of something else too, where I think I have different genres too. Like big doorstop epic fantasy. There's some leeway on sometimes on the plot getting started in some ways, right? Like depending on if the world building's good or if there's different things. And I remember like, and sometimes I will give it more of a chance if I've had a bunch of people saying no, this one really is good. One that just sticks out in my mind like that is the Gardens of the Moon, the first book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by named Erickson. Stephen. Yeah. That book, the first 100 pages is like not quite painful, but like it starts kind of, you're partially in here and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on and it wasn't terribly interesting and I don't know. I pushed it and I ended up really enjoying the book overall, but if I hadn't had a bunch of people recommending it over time, I would not have got through that first 100 pages. And I still haven't gone back to the series yet because I've got a lot of other series that I've been working on.
The series is hard going.
Pardon?
The series can be hard going. When you get to the end, the final book that pulls it all together makes you think, I'm really glad I read this. But when sort of there's another book, much like Gardens of the Moon, in the middle of the series, where it starts off bringing in a whole other chunk of the world, drawing it together in the same way, and you're putting these things, and I read some of them out of order, which didn't help. So
I cannot do that. With big epic fantasy, I freak out if I can't get the next get them in order.
Well, I was getting them from the library because that's huge doorstep fantasy. There isn't space in the house for all of the huge doorstep fantasy series that I'd like to read. So I would get a lot from the library, and it depends what's there. And sometimes I'd end up leapfrogging someone, so it'd take them longer to read the next one than it would me to finish the one I was on. So I'd get the one afterwards and then go back. So it's, in a way, it's a testament to the strength of him creating this huge interlocking narrative that it doesn't utterly fall apart if you read the books in a different order. But I agree with you totally that it is sort of hard to get started because he is right at the very end of there is this immensely epic pan-dimensional struggle, these thousands of people across various universes doing things, and all of them have interesting lives and are taking part, and there are massive battles and reasons for the massive battles and all of the politics of nations. So, and it's possibly the best recreation of reality as a fantasy series I can think of. Compared to a lot of epic fantasy, it's got more epic, more odd things, more economic systems,
crazy military stuff and battles, and like just the way that those are done too, right?
The battles are amazing. He's got different magic systems for different races that are actually fit together. So you get a lot of fantasy series where it's like, oh, it's elven magic, and people can't really use it because they're not elves. And you're going, well, why? What's going on here? But he's sat down and gone, well, okay, this event happened, which means that you can use this magic in this way, and then as people do epic quests, not only do politics change, but the magic systems change. So you can actually change, because you're affecting things on a sort of massive metaphysical level, it's changing the metaphysics of the universe rather than just being, oh yeah, the followers of this god have gained strength. And so, well, the followers of this god have gained strength, so the magic that comes from that god is now more powerful. Because he's done all of that, it does make it a lot harder to get into.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, would that first book get published as it is today? And I'm not sure it would.
I don't know. I
think he might have had to get it going a little faster in that first bit. I just think
Yeah, like all
That is
that
very
stuff you
weird.
guys, that all sounds really cool and like something I would enjoy, but not if he explained all of that
He doesn't
with
though.
200
It's
pages. No,
beyond. Oh, it's a bit like
Yeah.
it.
No, I agree.
It's a bit like
Well,
that.
it's interesting to hear Dave talk about it, but to read it would
Honestly,
like
it's the
so.
opposite.
And that's the other series, where we're talking. And so I think I'm more likely to give a book an opportunity to reel me in, like quality is of the writing or whatever is maybe less important to me as getting to the point. So
Right.
like the other book series that I put down and will never pick up again was The Wheel of Time. And you know that about me. It's the epic fan. It's that I want to get to the story, and that was a book where I read the first 100 pages and I was like, nothing's happened. Like, this is boring.
There's a combination of that and something about his style. Because I've tried a couple of times the beginning of it, and I haven't. I don't know if I've given it a fair shake, and I think I had that and several other things out of the library at the same time, every time. But I haven't read the first book because I haven't read any of it because just that something about it didn't grab me. And I don't know if I'll ever go there because there's so much other good stuff out there to read. And I hear then that the middle of the series, like that doesn't help, right? That there's mushy parts later on, and then Brandon Sanderson reinvigorates it to some extent, and that's a lot of books to commit to. So
it's flabby, definitely flabby in the middle, and I'm the opposite of possibly Patrick, that I read so fast that my life does have room for finishing books just on the off chance they get better. So if I hit a slack bit at the start of the book, because I know so many writers do get going later, I won't put a book down because the first couple of chapters are a little bit whooshy, a little bit wobbly, because for me it isn't that. It's not that much. It's not that much of an investment because when you read 150-ish books a year, a couple of chapters is half an hour's investment of time. So if I sit down to read a book, I'll give it at least an hour, probably, if I've made time to read. By that point, I'm far enough in that if there are good things about it, so it's got interesting ideas or good characterization, whatever, the wobbly bits are counteracted by the fact that there's something to keep me going. So possibly the reason I read so many books is because I don't put them down. So I'll keep reading once I've started reading, and then there are always other books that I'd like to read too, so it keeps you going. So when I do hit something that's a little bit slow, like Fitzgerald or whatever, I'll go, well, I'm halfway through this book, so it's another evening to finish it, maybe.
I find I tend to put stuff. I may not consciously stop reading it, but like I'll, because I tend to read a couple things at once, and so what happens is, I started. I mean, was it a couple months ago? I was reading a book that, I'm still reading it, but I haven't touched it in a couple months because I keep picking up other things instead, and so. So I think you kind of put books away that way too. As I've been reading Don Quixote for 2.5 years now. I'm still reading it. And it's high quality. It's just that when I sit down to read, it's not what I pick, right? And
definitely, there are some books it's hard to get into, where once I've started reading it, once I've re-cued my mind to the way the author writes, I really like reading it. So if I do spend an entire evening, but if it comes to just having 15 minutes, if I try to pick it up and go, by the time I'm starting to get into it, it's time to put it down again, so I don't bother with some authors for that length of time. So for that sort of 15-minute slots or so on, I might grab some poetry instead. But because I have two cats who absolutely love sitting on me, I do spend a lot of time sitting on the sofa. So settling in for sort of an hour or so to read is something I do anyway. So I can get into it. It's me, the book, the cats, and if I've remembered to get it before I sit down and get the kitten a hot drink of some kind, then I sort of crack on, and then I'm not stuck because I could turf them off, but sort of going, well, this book's a little bit boring, so I'll go and watch television. It's like, oh, well, that would involve like throwing the cats off, and well, I'll just give it a few more pages, and then it gives the author another chance to pull me in again.
Right.
I was going to say another interesting sort of different one on that, because like I with what you're saying there, like for Game of Thrones, when I've been reading that, I needed to get back to go into that second book. I needed to switch that mode, just because it is a more descriptive style than a lot of what I'm reading, and it is huge, and I know it's going to be committing me for a while because you don't switch back and forth. The switching costs of getting into that kind of a book is too much. But contrasting that with like right now reading this short story anthology, and I found that's a really neat combination, like the way these are working, because I know they're not going to be that long. The threshold might not have to be that high, but at the same time, there's a bunch of good ones in here. And this particular one, there's stories that I know I would have dropped if it hadn't been for this roguish with twists and swindles and reversals that you know are coming in them. So I'm like, I'm not liking the story really much, but there's going to be something interesting, so I'm going to keep going for that. So I don't know, but they've also been short story collections. I think have helped me to do that, stopping reading stuff, because if I'm really not enjoying the story, it's so easy to move on to the next one, especially on a Kindle where it's like you press the other forward button and you're on the next chapter and you'll never see that again, right? So
yeah, I mean, they're good palate cleansers. I kind of agree with you, Dave. I like to pick up poetry, especially between larger novels. It's just something about it that clears your perspective, and it's pretty awesome.
Okay, so we're coming up on we're just under an hour, actually, about 50 minutes. Any sort of final thoughts before we wrap things up?
We do have a comment from
Okay.
Maya. She says, I'm a slow reader, and my quality standard is actually really high because I spend a lot longer with a book and the language sits with me longer. This is a difference because I used to read really fast and I cared a lot about language then. If story is excellent and the writing quality and language is low, I just get too frustrated. And then Simon says, I'm completely the same way. I read so slowly that it has to be a really great book or I tend to lose interest.
Okay. So big thanks to Dave Higgins for joining us today on a lovely Saturday afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So would you like to, before we wrap it up, kind of tell everyone a little bit about not your reading, but the sort of the writing side of your life, and also kind of, where online is kind of the best place where people can stalk you and track you down and talk with you, buy your books.
Much like the center of my reading, the center of my writing is speculative fiction, and I write. Most of my published stuff is collections of short stories. I've got two collections of short stories. One of them sci-fi focused, the other more dark fantasy, sort of horror, dystopia in the real world sort of thing. And in parallel with that, I'm one half of Green Star with Simon Canton, which obviously you've talked about previously, and obviously you enjoyed it, so you're people of taste. To think the best place to find me, I'm on most places because Dave Higgins is quite a common name. By the time I got onto social media, someone else had grabbed it, and sometimes irritatingly grabbed it and then not done anything.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of places I use my middle initial. So I'm David_J_Higgins on Twitter, and David J. Higgins on WordPress for my blog. I've actually managed to get Dave Higgins on Google+, which quite surprised me because I was assuming that someone famous would have grabbed it, but I'm there. And best place to find all of my books. There's a list of everything on my blog. So davidjhiggins.wordpress.com.
Okay.
Want to go there, or they're on my Google Plus profile. So if people find me on Google Plus, there are links there. I'm not on Facebook because there's only so much social media you can handle before you start doing social media instead of actually writing.
Sure. Okay. And so there's a lot of different places for you to go. And of course, your books are available on. Are you everywhere? You're on Amazon and Kobo. You're not exclusive or anything.
Amazon, Kobo,
Okay.
Nook. Some of my books are on Google Play.
Okay.
I'm even in obscure places. I'm on Drive-Through Fiction, Screw Pulp. Some of my stuff is in Scribble.
Okay.
So
Good. Lots of options for sure.
so if you people want to search on whichever platform they're on, I probably got my books on there. And if anyone finds their favorite platform or retailer doesn't have me in it, then if they let me know, I'll try and turn up there as well.
It's good to be everywhere, except Facebook, apparently.
Well, if I had an extra sort of however many hours in the day where I could go, well, this is my extra Facebook time.
Yeah, there's only so much you can do.
There's only so much you can do and still sleep.
Yes.
And Facebook lost out because I wasn't on it when I started going, well, I should start sort of building my social media more professionally rather than just using it purely to keep up with friends.
Right.
Reading's better than Facebook anyway, so.
Well, yeah, reading's better than Facebook. Focusing in one place that people can find you is probably better than being on Facebook once a month.
Right.
So.
Okay. Well, thanks again for coming, Dave. It's been great having you.
It's been fun in playing.
And so and thanks to everyone who was in the comments for coming out and watching live. And for anyone who's listening after the fact, you can send us an email at tbrpodcast@gmail.com if you ever need to get a hold of us or you want to suggest a topic or anything like that. And don't forget to visit our Goodreads page. The link to that is in the show description below. And of course, we appreciate all subscribers, reviewers, and ratings on the YouTube and iTunes. Our next episode will be airing on February the 3rd. Today's sort of Saturday episode replaces where we would normally broadcast on a Tuesday evening, but we'll post some stuff on Tuesday anyway, just so people don't forget. And on February the 3rd, we're going to be talking about subgenres in science fiction. So until then, everybody have a great week and a half, and we'll talk to you soon.
Happy reading.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.